The dust of redemption baked under the noon sun. It settled on every hat brim, every weathered plank, and on the still, heavy air that hung over the town square. In the center of that square stood the gallows, a fresh-cut skeleton of pine against a merciless blue sky. And on that gallows stood Sarah Jenkins, a mother of one, her hands bound, her face a mask of stone. Sheriff Miller stood beside her. He was a hard man, built from the same unforgiving timber as the gallows itself. He held the verdict in his hand, a piece of paper that felt as heavy as a tombstone. The whole town was there, a silent, grim-faced jury packed between the saloon and the general store. They'd come to see justice done for the murder of Jonas Jenkins, a man they'd all known, a man they'd all liked, Sarah's husband. Miller cleared his throat, the sound like rocks grinding together. By the authority of this territory, he began, his voice carrying in the unnatural quiet. Sarah Jenkins has been found guilty of the murder of her husband. The sentence is death by hanging. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, their faces tight with grim satisfaction. Others looked away, at their own dusty boots, at the heat shimmering off the rooftops. They were here for the end of a story of a good man and a bad wife. But the story wasn't over, because that's when he arrived. He came on a black horse that moved like a shadow, parting the crowd without a sound. He was Silas Blackwood, the cattleman. He owned the North Valley, the long river, and the silence of any man who worked for him. He was richer than the town, more powerful than the law, and colder than a winter grave. He stopped his horse at the edge of the square, just far enough to see everything. He wore a long dark coat despite the heat, and his face was hidden in the shade of his hat. Sheriff Miller saw him. Everyone saw him. The whole town held its breath, waiting. Blackwood and Miller had a history, an unspoken war of fences and water rights that simmered just beneath the surface of civility. A word from Blackwood could stop this. A nod could send a dozen of his men into the square. But the cattleman said nothing. He just sat there on his horse, watching. His stillness was an accusation, but no one knew who it was aimed at. Sheriff Miller's jaw tightened. He would not be intimidated. He turned back to Sarah. Her eyes were fixed on something far beyond the town, beyond the dusty plains. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at the sheriff. And she did not look at Silas Blackwood. It was as if she were already gone. "May God have mercy on your soul," Miller finished, his voice strained. He slipped the coarse hemp rope over her head, letting the noose settle around her neck. She didn't flinch. He stepped back, away from the trapdoor. His gaze flickered one last time toward the man on the black horse. The cattleman said nothing. He didn't move a muscle. He didn't blink. He just watched, a silent statue of judgment. Miller took that as consent, or maybe he just didn't care anymore. He was the law, and the law had spoken. He raised his hand, a clear signal to his deputy, a young man named Finn, who stood trembling by the lever. The sun beat down, a dog barked somewhere, and was quickly silenced. The world seemed to shrink to the space between the sheriff's raised hand and the wooden lever. Sarah closed her eyes. Miller's hand dropped. The world exploded into sound. The sharp crack of the lever, the groan of the trapdoor hinges, a collective gasp from the crowd. Sarah fell, a sudden, brutal drop into nothingness. The rope snapped taut. But then, something impossible happened. A silver glint flashed through the air, faster than a hummingbird's wing. It spun end over end, a blur of deadly light that struck the rope just above Sarah's head. Thwack. The thick rope, stretched to its limit, parted with a sound like a bullwhip's crack. It uncoiled, spitting fibers. Sarah fell the last few feet to the ground, landing in a heap, alive, gasping, the severed noose still around her neck. The crowd erupted. People shouted, pointing, stumbling back. Sheriff Miller spun around, his hand already on his pistol. His eyes shot to the edge of the square. Silas Blackwood was no longer on his horse. He stood on the ground, his long coat pushed back. In his hand was a second knife, the twin of the one now buried deep in the gallows post. He had not said a word, but he had just declared war. "Blackwood!" Miller roared, his voice cracking with fury. He drew his Colt, the hammer clicking back with a sound that cut through the chaos. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" The cattleman took a slow step forward, his boots crunching in the dirt. His eyes, cold and dark, were fixed on the sheriff. "I'm correcting a mistake," Blackwood said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the square like a death sentence. He kept walking, not toward the sheriff, but toward the gallows, toward Sarah, who was now pushing herself up, coughing, the raw red mark of the rope burning on her skin. Two of Miller's deputies moved to intercept him, their own guns drawn but held with uncertainty. Blackwood didn't even look at them. He just kept walking. "Stop right there," Miller shouted, aiming his pistol square at Blackwood's chest. "This is the law. She was tried and convicted." Blackwood finally stopped, just feet from the gallows platform. He looked from Miller's gun to Miller's eyes. There was no fear in his gaze. There was something else. Something that looked almost like pity. "Your law is blind, Miller," he said, "and you're a fool." He moved again, faster than anyone could react. He bent down, scooped up the dazed and trembling Sarah, and threw her over his shoulder like a sack of grain. He turned, ready to walk away with the town's condemned prisoner. The crowd was in an uproar. Some were angry, shouting for Miller to shoot him. Others were terrified, backing away from the silent, deadly cattle baron who had just defied a hanging. "I'll put a bullet in you, Blackwood. I swear it," Miller screamed, his face purple with rage. Blackwood paused, his back to the sheriff. He didn't turn around. "You do that," he said, his voice a low growl, "and my men will burn this town to the ground before your body is cold. They're in the hills, watching, waiting for my signal." A new kind of fear washed over the square, colder than the anger. Everyone knew about Blackwood's men. They were hard cases, loyal only to his gold. They could do it. They would do it. Sheriff Miller's hand trembled. The barrel of his Colt wavered. He was the law, but Silas Blackwood was power. And in the unforgiving light of that dusty square, power was winning. Blackwood started walking again, carrying Sarah toward his horse. No one dared to stop him. He was 10 steps away, 20. Then just as he reached his horse, he stopped one last time. He turned his head just enough to look back at Miller. "She didn't kill him," he said. And with that, he swung himself and Sarah up onto the black horse, spurted hard, and galloped out of town, leaving a cloud of dust and a storm of questions behind him. The sheriff stood there, gun still raised, his authority shattered, the severed rope swinging gently in the hot breeze like a mocking finger. The hanging was over, but the real trial had just begun. Sheriff Miller lowered his gun, his knuckles white. The town square was a hornet's nest of confusion. His deputies, Finn included, looked at him, waiting for an order he didn't know how to give. "Sheriff?" Finn asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What do we do?" Miller didn't answer. He walked over to the gallows post and yanked Blackwood's knife out of the wood. It was a perfectly balanced blade, heavy and cold. Not a rancher's tool, a weapon. He stared at the knife, then at the road where Blackwood had disappeared. "She didn't kill him." The words echoed in his head. How could he know that? Why now? Why wait until the rope was tight around her neck to play his hand? "He's making a fool of us," Miller snarled, more to himself than to anyone else. He turned to his men. "Finn, you and Jeb, get horses. We're going after him." "To his ranch, Sheriff?" Jeb asked, his eyes wide. "That place is a fortress." "We're not storming his fortress," Miller snapped. "We're bringing him in for interfering with a lawful execution, and we're bringing her back." He stormed toward his office, the crowd parting before him. He slammed the door, the windows rattling. He felt a rage so pure it almost blinded him. Jonas had been his friend. They'd ridden together, shared drinks, helped each other through hard winters. He had found Jonas's body himself, lying in the cold straw of his own barn, a pitchfork wound in his chest. And he'd found Sarah standing over him, her hands clean, her eyes empty, with a story that made no sense. She claimed she'd been out riding, but her horse was dry. She claimed she'd heard a noise, but no one else had. The trial had been swift. The evidence was circumstantial, but damning. A neighbor heard them arguing violently that night. Sarah couldn't produce a single tear for her dead husband. Her coldness had convicted her as much as any fact. Now Blackwood, a man who hated Jonas almost as much as he hated Miller, was claiming she was innocent. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. A power play. Blackwood wanted to prove he was above the law, that he was the law in this valley. Miller buckled on a fresh gun belt. He wasn't just bringing back a prisoner anymore. He was going to war with Silas Blackwood. An hour later, they were riding hard, kicking up a trail of dust that rose high into the sky. Miller, Finn, and Jeb. 3 men against whatever Blackwood had waiting for them. They topped a rise and saw it. Blackwood's ranch. It wasn't a ranch so much as a small kingdom. A massive stone and timber house stood on a hill, surrounded by a high fence. Bunkhouses, barns, and corrals spread out below it. And on the fence posts, every 50 yards, was a man with a rifle. They watched Miller's posse approach, their faces impassive. As they got closer, the main gate swung open. But it wasn't a group of armed men who came out to meet them. It was Silas Blackwood alone. He stood in the gateway, his hands empty, his long coat unbuttoned. He looked calm, as if he'd been expecting them. "That's far enough, Sheriff," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying easily on the wind. Miller pulled his horse to a halt. "I'm here for the prisoner, Blackwood, and I'm arresting you for obstruction of justice." Blackwood almost smiled. It was a chilling sight. "You're not arresting anyone today, and she's not a prisoner. She's a guest." "She's a convicted murderer," Miller roared. "She's a widow who was framed," Blackwood countered, his voice dropping, becoming more serious. "And you fell for it. You were so blinded by your friendship with that cheating drunk, you couldn't see the truth right in front of your face." The insult hit Miller like a physical blow. "Jonas wasn't a cheater, wasn't he?" Blackwood took a step forward. "Ask yourself, Miller, where was Jonas's body found?" "In his barn. You know that." "And what was on his boots?" Miller paused. The question was so specific, so strange. He had a photographic memory of the scene, the smell of hay and blood, the way the light cut through the dusty air. "Mud," he said finally, "and straw." "What kind of mud?" Blackwood pressed. "What does it matter? It was mud." "It matters," Blackwood said, his eyes drilling into Miller's. "Because the soil in Jonas's barn is sandy loam, dry as a bone this time of year. But his boots were caked in thick black river mud, the kind of mud you only find one place in this valley." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "My western property line, 3 miles from his barn?" Miller stared at him, his mind reeling. He remembered the mud now. It had been thick, caked deep in the treads of Jonas's boots. He hadn't thought anything of it, but Blackwood was right. That kind of mud wasn't anywhere near the Jenkins ranch. "What are you saying?" Miller asked, his voice suddenly hoarse. "I'm saying he wasn't killed in his barn," Blackwood said. "He was killed by the river, and his body was moved. Sarah didn't kill him. She just found him." The foundation of Miller's certainty began to crack. He had built his entire case on the location, on the fight the neighbor heard. If the body was moved, then everything changed. "Why?" Miller demanded. "Why would someone move the body?" "To frame her," Blackwood said simply. "To make it look like a domestic dispute. Simple, clean, the perfect crime." A cold dread trickled down Miller's spine. Was it possible? Had he been so eager to find a culprit that he'd missed the obvious? "You're lying," Miller said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're making this up to protect her." Blackwood shook his head slowly. "I'm not protecting her. I'm trying to find a killer. The same killer you should be looking for. But you're too busy aiming your gun at the wrong person." He turned and walked back toward the gate. "Go back to town, Sheriff. Go back to your evidence. Think about the mud, or stay here and start a fight you can't win. The choice is yours." The gate began to swing shut, leaving Blackwood inside his fortress. Miller sat on his horse, frozen. The sun beat down on his neck. The faces of his deputies were a mixture of confusion and fear. He looked at the mud on his own horse's hooves. Sandy loam. He looked back at the imposing ranch house, where a convicted murderer was now a guest. He had two choices: trust the law he had built his life on, or trust the word of his greatest enemy. He had a horrifying feeling they might be the same thing. Miller turned his horse around without a word and rode back toward redemption. He felt the eyes of Blackwood's riflemen on his back the entire way. The ride back was silent and tense. Finn and Jeb kept glancing at him, but knew better than to ask questions. Miller's face was a thundercloud. The mud. The damn mud. It was such a small detail, but it was like a crack in a dam. Everything was starting to leak through. He replayed the investigation in his mind. He'd been so sure. The fight, the coldness from Sarah, the convenience of it all. Jonas was dead, and his wife was the only one there. It was the oldest story in the book. But Blackwood wasn't a man who dealt in stories. He dealt in facts. Cold, hard, profitable facts. He wouldn't risk a war with the town for a lie. There was something else going on, something he wasn't saying. Back in his office, he pulled out the file on the Jenkins murder. He flipped through his own notes, his handwriting looking alien and overconfident. Suspect, Sarah Jenkins. Motive, marital strife. Witness, Martha Gable, neighbor. Heard shouting approx. 10 p.m., found body at 6 a.m. Suspect shows no remorse. He slammed the file shut. It was thin, too thin. He'd let his friendship with Jonas and his dislike of Sarah's standoffish nature guide him more than the evidence had. "Finn," he called out. The young deputy appeared in the doorway. "Ride out to the Gable place. Talk to Martha again. I want every word she heard that night. Every single word. Don't lead her. Just let her talk." Finn nodded, glad to have a clear order. "Yes, sir." "And Jeb," Miller continued, "go to the stable. Find Jonas's horse, the one he rode the day he died. Check its hooves. See if you can find any trace of that Black River mud." The deputy scurried out, leaving Miller alone with his doubts. He sank into his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. He felt like he'd been played for a fool, but he didn't know who the player was. Blackwood or the real killer? Meanwhile, at the Blackwood Ranch, Sarah was led into the main house. It was more luxurious than any place she had ever seen. Polished wood floors, a massive stone fireplace, leather chairs that looked soft as butter. Blackwood deposited her unceremoniously on a rug. "Stay here." He turned and left, locking the heavy oak door behind him. She was still a prisoner, just in a much larger, more comfortable cell. She ran to the window. It was barred with ornate ironwork. She could see the courtyard, the armed men patrolling the fences. There was no escape. A few minutes later, the door opened again. A young boy ran in, his face stained with tears. "Mama! Eli!" Sarah cried, dropping to her knees and pulling her son into a fierce embrace. It was Eli, her 8-year-old boy. She hadn't seen him since her arrest. She had thought he was with Martha Gable. "How did you get here?" she whispered, stroking his hair, checking him for any sign of harm. "Mr. Blackwood's men," Eli said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "They came and got me this morning. Before they took you." Sarah's blood ran cold. Blackwood had taken her son before the hanging. He had known all along that he was going to intervene. This wasn't a last-minute decision. It was a calculated move in a game she didn't understand. The door opened again. Blackwood stood there, his face unreadable. "He's safe here," Blackwood said. "What do you want from me?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with a mix of gratitude and fear. "Why are you doing this?" Blackwood walked over to a table and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He didn't offer her one. "Jonas was a thief," he said, turning to face her, the glass in his hand. "For the last 6 months, he's been rebranding my cattle and selling them to the railroad. He stole over 100 head from me." Sarah stared at him, shocked. "No, Jonas wouldn't." "He did," Blackwood cut her off. "I have the proof. Shipping manifests with his signature on them. I was going to ruin him. I was going to take everything he had. Your ranch, your home, everything." He took a long swallow of whiskey. "But then someone killed him first, and you were the perfect scapegoat." Sarah felt the room spin. Jonas, a cattle thief? It didn't seem possible. But the way Blackwood said it, with such dead certainty, left little room for doubt. "Who?" she whispered. "Who killed him?" "That's what you're going to help me find out," Blackwood said. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "You were there, Sarah, in the house. You must have seen something, heard something. A strange rider? A conversation you weren't supposed to hear? Think. His tone wasn't kind. It wasn't gentle. He wasn't a savior. He was an interrogator. He hadn't saved her for her own sake. He'd saved her because she was a loose end, a piece of his puzzle. He wanted his property back, or the man who stole it. Jonas's death had complicated that. I told the sheriff everything I know, she said weakly. I was out riding. When I came back, he was... She couldn't finish the sentence. A lie, Blackwood said flatly. Your horse was in the stable, bone dry and fed. You never left the ranch. So I'll ask you again. What did you see? Sarah shrank back, pulling Eli closer. This man hadn't just saved her from the gallows. He had pulled her into a much deeper, much more dangerous world. A world of stolen cattle, of hidden enemies, and of a powerful man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. She was out of the fire, but she had landed squarely in the furnace, and she was beginning to suspect that Silas Blackwood was the one who had lit the match. Sheriff Miller paced his office like a caged wolf. The sun was setting, painting the sky in angry shades of red and orange. Jeb had returned from the stables an hour ago, his face grim. You were right, Sheriff, he'd said, holding out a hoof pick. It was caked with dark, thick mud. Found it packed deep in the frog of the left forehoof. It's river mud, no doubt about it. Another piece of Miller's case crumbled to dust. Jonas had been at the river. Why would he lie to Sarah about where he was going? Or had he gone to meet someone? Just then, Finn rode back into town, his horse lathered. He burst into the office. Sheriff, I talked to Martha Gable, he said, catching his breath. It's different than what she said at the trial. Miller stopped pacing. How different? At the trial, she said she heard them fighting, Jonas and Sarah. But tonight, she told me she couldn't be sure. She said she heard Jonas shouting for certain. He was angry. But the other voice, she said it was lower, harder to hear. She assumed it was Sarah. But now, Finn trailed off, looking uneasy. But now she's not so sure, Miller finished for him, a sick feeling growing in his stomach. Did she hear what they were saying? Only a few words, Finn said, pulling out his notebook. She heard Jonas yell, I don't have it. It'll take more time. And then, a little later, she heard him shout, You can't threaten my family. Miller sank into his chair. This wasn't a husband and wife fighting over dinner. This was something else entirely. Jonas wasn't arguing. He was pleading. He was being threatened. The man he'd thought was the victim was involved in something deep and dangerous. And the woman he'd almost hanged was caught in the middle of it. The whole case was a house of cards, and Blackwood had just blown it over. He had to talk to Sarah again. But she was in Blackwood's fortress. He couldn't just ride up and demand an interview. He needed a way in. He needed eyes inside that ranch. He looked at Finn. The deputy was young, eager, and smarter than he looked. He was also small and quick. Finn, Miller said, his voice low and serious, I need you to do something for me. Something dangerous. Something off the record. Finn's eyes widened, but he nodded. Anything, Sheriff. I need you to get inside Blackwood's ranch, Miller said. I don't want a confrontation. I want you to slip in after dark. Watch him. Watch Sarah. I need to know what Blackwood is really up to. Is he protecting her, or is he holding her prisoner? And if they catch me? Finn asked, his voice steady despite the obvious risk. Then I don't know you, Miller said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. You're on your own. Finn stared at his sheriff for a long moment. He saw the desperation in the older man's eyes, the desperation to find the truth, to make things right. I'll do it, Finn said. That night, under the sliver of a moon, Finn crept toward the Blackwood ranch. He left his horse a mile back and moved through the sagebrush like a ghost. The place was lit up, with lanterns on the porch and in the bunkhouse windows. The guards on the fence line were alert, their silhouettes dark against the starry sky. Getting in wouldn't be easy. He circled the perimeter, looking for a weak spot. He found it on the southern edge, where a small creek cut under the fence. The gap was narrow, but maybe just wide enough. He slid into the cold water, submerged himself completely, and pulled himself through the muddy opening, emerging inside the ranch's boundaries, dripping and shivering. He was in. He moved silently toward the main house, keeping to the shadows cast by the outbuildings. He could hear the low murmur of conversation from the bunkhouse, the gentle nicker of horses in the corral. Everything seemed normal, too normal. He found a spot beneath a large window on the side of the main house. The curtains were partially drawn, offering a sliver of a view into what looked like a study or a parlor. And then he saw them, Blackwood and Sarah. They were standing on opposite sides of a large wooden desk. Blackwood was pacing, agitated. Sarah was standing perfectly still, her arms wrapped around herself. Eli was nowhere to be seen. Finn pressed his ear against the glass, trying to hear. The words were faint, muffled. "No other choice," Blackwood was saying. "He was going to expose you." Sarah's reply was too quiet to hear. Blackwood slammed his hand down on the desk. The sound made Finn jump. "He gave me his word. He promised to leave you out of it." The man was a snake, Sarah. A weak, pathetic snake. Was he talking about Jonas? It sounded like it, but his words were strange. He was going to expose you. What did Sarah have to be exposed for? Then Sarah spoke, her voice clearer this time, sharp with an emotion Finn couldn't place. It sounded like anger. "You left me there, Silas," she said, her voice shaking. "You let me marry him. You let me have a child with him. You watched from your throne on this hill, and you did nothing." "Silas?" She called him Silas, not Mr. Blackwood. Blackwood stopped pacing. He turned to her, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "I gave you a chance at a normal life," he said, his voice rough. "A life away from me, away from what our father was." Finn's mind raced. "Our father?" Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "A normal life? With him? He was just a different kind of monster. And you knew it. You always knew." Finn felt the ground shift beneath him. This wasn't an interrogation. This wasn't a cattle baron and a murderer's widow. This was a family argument. The pieces clicked into place with dizzying speed. The way Blackwood looked at her, the way he'd taken her son, the familiar way she spoke his name. They weren't strangers. They weren't captor and captive. Silas Blackwood and Sarah Jenkins were brother and sister. The revelation hit Finn like a physical blow. He stumbled back from the window, his heart pounding. This changed everything. Blackwood hadn't saved a random woman from the gallows. He had saved his own sister. But that just raised 1,000 more questions. Why the estrangement? Why did he let her stand on the gallows until the last possible second? And what secret was he so afraid Jonas was going to expose? Finn knew he had to get back to Miller. This was bigger than a simple murder case. This was a family secret buried so deep it had just cost one man his life and nearly cost a woman hers. As he began to creep back toward the fence line, his foot caught on something in the dark. He bent down and picked it up. It was a small object, carved from a piece of soft wood. A little bird. Finn had seen a bird just like it before. He'd seen Eli, Sarah's son, whittling one just like it outside the general store a few weeks ago. The boy was always carving them. He must have dropped it. Finn clutched the wooden bird in his hand. It felt like a key to a door he wasn't sure he wanted to open. He looked back at the house, at the sliver of light in the window. He wasn't just watching a cattle baron's game anymore. He was standing in the middle of a family's war, and the casualties were just starting to mount. Finn made it back to town before dawn, his clothes still damp, his mind buzzing. He found Miller asleep in his office chair, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the desk beside him. "Sheriff," Finn said, shaking him awake. Miller jolted up, his eyes bleary. "Finn? What is it? What did you find?" Finn laid the wooden bird on the desk. "Eli's. I found it near the house." Then he took a deep breath. "And that's not all. Blackwood and Sarah, their brother and sister." Miller stared at him, the sleepiness vanishing from his eyes, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. "What? I heard them. She called him Silas. They were arguing. About her marriage to Jonas. About their father. It's why he saved her, Sheriff. She's his family." The sheriff stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the graying sky. The whole affair was twisting into something dark and knotted. A secret family connection. A bitter history. "It still doesn't make sense," Miller muttered. If she's his sister, why did he wait? Why let it get that far? It was cruel. I don't know, Finn admitted. But he's not just protecting her. He's looking for something. He kept pressing her about what she saw, what she knew about Jonas's business. Finn then told him what Blackwood had claimed, that Jonas was stealing his cattle. Miller rubbed his temples. Jonas, a cattle rustler. It seemed so out of character. But the mud on his boots, the threats Martha Gable had overheard, it was all pointing away from a simple domestic murder and towards something much more complex. Blackwood said Jonas was selling to the railroad, Finn added. The railroad. That meant paperwork. Records. The station master, Miller said, a new energy in his voice. He keeps copies of all the shipping manifests. If Jonas was selling stolen cattle, his name will be on them. An hour later, as the sun began to rise, Miller was kicking open the door to the railroad station office. The station master, a perpetually nervous man named Peterson, nearly jumped out of his skin. Sheriff, what's all this? I need to see your shipping manifests for the last 6 months, Miller demanded. All cattle shipments. Peterson wrung his hands. But Sheriff, those are private records. Mr. Caldwell, the railroad supervisor, he'd have my hide. Mr. Caldwell isn't the law in this town, Miller growled, leaning over the counter. I am. Get me the books. Faced with Miller's fury, Peterson complied. He pulled out a series of heavy ledgers. Miller and Finn began poring over them, page by page. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. There it was, in black and white. Dozens of entries, small shipments at first, then larger ones. Cattle sold by Jonas Jenkins. And the brand listed on the manifest wasn't Jonas's simple J-Bar-J. It was the B-Cross of the Blackwood Ranch. Blackwood had been telling the truth. Jonas was a thief. He'd been systematically stealing from his powerful neighbor. But why? Finn wondered aloud. The Jenkins ranch isn't poor. He had his own herd. Miller pointed to another column in the ledger. Payments. The amounts Jonas received were shockingly low, barely a third of market value. He wasn't getting rich. He was desperate. He wasn't selling them for profit, Miller said, the pieces falling into place. He was paying off a debt. Someone was squeezing him. The name the station master had mentioned came back to him. Caldwell, the railroad supervisor, a man from back east who was known for his ruthless business practices. He was the one buying the cattle. Was he also the one Jonas owed? Suddenly, the threats Martha Gable overheard made perfect sense. I don't have it. It'll take more time. Jonas wasn't talking to his wife. He was talking to a creditor, a dangerous one. This man Caldwell had a motive to kill Jonas. If Jonas couldn't pay, maybe he was threatening to expose the whole scheme. A dead man can't talk. And his wife, conveniently taking the blame, would tie it all up in a neat little bow. The land, the remaining cattle, would all fall into foreclosure, right into the railroad's hands. Miller felt a chill. He had almost hanged an innocent woman to cover up a land grab. He had been a pawn in their game. His grief for his friend had made him the perfect tool. Finn, Miller said, his voice grim, we've been looking for a killer in the wrong place. Our murderer doesn't wear dusty boots and a cowboy hat. I'll bet he wears a suit and polished city shoes. He closed the ledger with a thud. We need to talk to Sarah again. And this time, we're not asking. We're telling her what we know. We need her to fill in the last piece of the puzzle. But getting to Sarah meant going through Blackwood again. This time, Miller wouldn't go with guns drawn. He'd go with something far more powerful. The truth. When Miller and Finn rode up to the Blackwood Ranch for the second time, the guards at the gate were just as imposing. But this time, Miller wasn't there to make demands. Tell Mr. Blackwood that Sheriff Miller is here to discuss Jonas Jenkins's business with the railroad, he announced, his voice calm and firm. The message was sent. A few minutes later, the gates swung open. Blackwood was waiting for them in the courtyard, his expression wary. You've been busy, Sheriff, Blackwood said. It wasn't a question. I have, Miller replied, dismounting. And I think you and I need to have a conversation. All of us. He nodded toward the main house, indicating Sarah. Blackwood hesitated for a moment, then gave a curt nod. They entered the large parlor where Finn had spied on them the night before. Sarah was there, sitting by the window, her son Eli quietly whittling a piece of wood beside her. She looked up as they entered, her eyes full of distrust. "What is this?" she asked, her voice sharp. "This is me admitting I was wrong," Miller said, taking off his hat. The words felt strange in his mouth, but necessary. "I arrested you for the wrong reasons. I let my friendship with Jonas blind me to the facts. For that, I am truly sorry." Sarah stared at him, her hard expression softening just a fraction. "Jonas was stealing from you," Miller said, looking directly at Blackwood. "Selling your cattle to a railroad man named Caldwell to pay off a debt. He was in over his head, and Caldwell killed him to shut him up and take his land." Blackwood didn't look surprised. "I suspected as much." "Then why all the theatrics?" Miller demanded, his frustration rising again. "Why the show at the gallows? Why not just tell me this from the start?" Blackwood looked away toward his sister. "Because it wasn't my story to tell, and because I needed to be sure you were smart enough to figure it out yourself and not just Caldwell's puppet." The insult was delivered so flatly it was almost a statement of fact. "And what about you?" Miller said, turning to Sarah. "You let me believe you were a killer. You stood on that platform and said nothing. Why?" Sarah finally stood up, her eyes flashing with a pain and anger that seemed years old. "And what was I supposed to say?" she shot back. "That my husband was a thief? That he'd gotten himself tangled up with dangerous men who had threatened to kill our son if he didn't pay? I tried to get him to run, to leave it all behind, but he was too proud, or too scared." She took a shaky breath. "The night he died, that man Caldwell was there. I didn't see his face. I was hiding in the loft, but I heard him. He told Jonas his time was up. Jonas begged. Then there was a fight. When I came down, Jonas was dead and the man was gone. I knew they would come for Eli next, so I said nothing. I let you think I did it. A hanging is quick. What they would have done to my boy would have been slow. Her sacrifice was stunning. She was willing to die to protect her son from the truth. And you," she said, her voice dripping with venom as she turned to Blackwood. "You knew. You knew Jonas was in trouble. You could have helped, but you just watched. You let it happen. You wanted to see him fail." "He made his own choices," Blackwood said, his voice cold, but his eyes held a flicker of something else. "Regret." "And you let me hang for them!" she cried. The room fell silent, the air thick with years of unspoken bitterness. It was Eli, the little boy, who broke the silence. He had been watching the adults, his face pale, his carving knife still. "I saw him," he whispered. Everyone turned to look at him. "What did you say, Eli?" Sarah asked gently, kneeling beside him. "I saw the man," Eli repeated, his voice a little stronger. "I was in the barn, hiding in the haymow. I saw him talking to Papa. Did you see his face, son?" Miller asked, his heart starting to pound. Eli shook his head. "No, it was too dark, but I saw his boots." "His boots?" "They were shiny," Eli said, his eyes focused on the memory. "Not like Papa's or Mr. Blackwood's boots. They were fancy, city boots, and one of them had a star on the back. A star, a spur." "A silver spur?" Finn asked, stepping forward. Eli's eyes lit up with recognition. "Yes, a silver star. It shined in the lantern light." Miller and Blackwood exchanged a look. It was thin, the word of a child, but it was more than they'd had a day ago. It was a detail only a true witness would know. Just then, one of Blackwood's men burst into the room. "Mr. Blackwood, sir," he said out of breath. "There's a rider coming. Says he's a railroad supervisor named Caldwell. He's here to settle the Jenkins account." A deadly quiet fell over the room. The killer wasn't a distant threat anymore. He was at the gate. "He's arrogant," Miller said, his hand instinctively going to his gun. "He thinks Sarah is dead or locked away. He's come to pick the bones." Blackwood's face was like granite. "He's not taking anything from this valley." He looked at the guard. "Let him in. Send him to the saloon in town. Tell him I'll meet him there to discuss the Jenkins property. A business matter." The guard nodded and left. "What are you planning?" Miller asked. "Justice," Blackwood said simply. "He came here expecting to find a dead woman in a grieving town. Instead, he's going to find a witness." He looked down at Eli. No, Sarah said instantly, pulling her son behind her. I won't let you use him. He's a child. He's the only one who can identify him, Blackwood insisted. There's another way, Miller interjected. He looked at Finn, then at the wooden bird the deputy had found. An idea, desperate and dangerous, was forming in his mind. We don't need Eli to be in the room, Miller said. We just need his eyes. He explained his plan. It was risky. It relied on trickery, on Caldwell's arrogance, and on perfect timing. If it went wrong, they'd all be dead. Sarah looked from Miller to Blackwood, two men she had no reason to trust, but they were all she had. She finally gave a slow, reluctant nod. All right, Blackwood said, turning to Miller. Let's see if your brand of justice works any better than it did yesterday. The Redemption Saloon was buzzing with nervous energy. The news of Caldwell's arrival had spread like wildfire. The townsfolk knew something was about to happen. They huddled at tables, pretending to drink, their eyes darting toward the swinging doors. Sheriff Miller stood behind the bar, polishing a glass, looking for all the world like a simple bartender. Blackwood sat at a corner table, alone, a bottle of whiskey and two glasses in front of him. He looked completely at ease, a spider in the center of his web. The swinging doors creaked open. A man stepped inside and the entire saloon fell silent. He was dressed in a fine Eastern suit, his face clean-shaven and smug. He paused for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light, a look of disdain on his face as he surveyed the rustic room. And on his feet were a pair of immaculate, polished city boots. On the heel of the right boot was a single ornate silver spur, shaped like a five-pointed star. It was him, Caldwell. He spotted Blackwood and sauntered over to the table, his boots clicking on the wooden floor. Mr. Blackwood, he said, his voice smooth and confident. I'm Caldwell. I believe you and I have some business to discuss regarding the unfortunate Jenkins estate. He sat down without being invited, pouring himself a glass of Blackwood's whiskey. A tragedy. What happened to that family? The woman was clearly unstable, but it does simplify the property transfer. Blackwood leaned back in his chair, his face a neutral mask. Does it? Of course, Caldwell said with a dismissive wave. The bank will foreclose, and the railroad is always happy to acquire new land for expansion. It's just business. You seem to know a lot about it, Blackwood said, his voice dangerously soft. Caldwell chuckled. I make it my business to know things. For instance, I know that Jonas Jenkins was in debt up to his eyeballs. I know he was getting desperate, and I know desperate men do stupid things. So do their wives. He took a sip of whiskey. It's a clean narrative. The sheriff did good work, quick and tidy. From behind the bar, Miller felt a surge of cold fury. This man was gloating, confessing without even knowing it. The sheriff made a mistake, Blackwood said, his eyes never leaving Caldwell's. Caldwell raised an eyebrow. Oh, I thought everything was settled. The wife confessed, I heard. She didn't confess, a new voice said. Sheriff Miller stepped out from behind the bar, his badge glinting in the lamplight. He held a shotgun in his hands, its barrels aimed squarely at Caldwell's chest. The hanging was interrupted, Miller said. Caldwell's smug expression vanished. He looked from Miller to Blackwood, his eyes widening in alarm. He started to stand up, his hand dropping toward the small pistol tucked in his waistband. I wouldn't, Blackwood said, and for the first time Caldwell saw the big Colt revolver that had been lying in Blackwood's lap the whole time, now pointed at his gut. Caldwell froze. What is this? This is an outrage. I'm an officer of the railroad. You're a murderer, Miller said. You have no proof. Caldwell spat, his confidence returning as a bluff. You have nothing? Just the ravings of a crazy woman? We have more than that, Miller said. He nodded toward the back room of the saloon. The door opened. Finn stepped out, holding a small object in his hand. It was a freshly carved wooden bird, identical to the one Eli always made. We have a witness who saw you in the barn that night, Miller said. He saw you argue with Jonas. He saw you kill him. Caldwell paled, but he forced a laugh. A witness? Who? No one saw me. He didn't see your face, Miller admitted, but he saw something very specific, something he described to us in perfect detail. Finn set the little wooden bird on the bar. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a second, identical bird. The one he'd found at the Blackwood Ranch. He placed it right beside the first one. "He told us," Miller said, his voice cold and steady, "that the killer wore fancy city boots, and on one of them, a silver spur, shaped like a star." Caldwell's eyes darted down to his own feet, as if he'd forgotten what he was wearing. The silver spur gleamed. It was a confession more damning than any words. His face turned ashen. He was trapped, but he wasn't beaten. With a primal roar, he kicked the table over, sending whiskey and glasses flying. The crash was a diversion. In that split second, he drew his pistol and fired, not at Miller or Blackwood, but at the big lantern hanging from the ceiling. The lantern exploded, plunging the saloon into near-total darkness, pierced only by thin shafts of afternoon light from the dirty windows. Shouts erupted. People scrambled for cover. In the chaos, Caldwell dove behind the overturned table. Another shot rang out, and a splinter of wood flew from the bar next to Miller's head. Blackwood returned fire, the boom of his Colt deafening in the enclosed space. Miller dropped behind the bar, the shotgun now useless in the close quarters. He drew his own revolver. "He's trying to get to the back door," he yelled. He could hear Caldwell scrambling in the dark. Another shot, this one from Blackwood's direction, was answered by a pained grunt. Suddenly, a dark shape rushed past the end of the bar. It was Caldwell, heading for the exit. Miller rose up and fired. The bullet went wide. Caldwell was almost at the door. He was going to get away. But then something flashed through the gloom, a glint of steel spinning through the dusty air. It was a knife, thrown from the corner where Blackwood was crouched. The knife flew with impossible speed and accuracy, crossing the entire length of the room. It struck Caldwell square in the shoulder of his gun arm. He screamed, a high-pitched sound of pain and shock, and his pistol clattered to the floor. He stumbled, clutching his arm, and fell through the back door, disappearing into the alleyway. "He's hit!" Miller shouted, vaulting over the bar. "He won't get far." Miller and Blackwood ran out into the alley. Caldwell was staggering down the narrow lane, leaving a trail of blood. He was cornered. He turned, his face a mask of desperation and hate. "You won't take me alive," he snarled, pulling the knife from his shoulder and lunging at Miller. Miller didn't have time to aim. He just fired. The shot echoed between the buildings. Caldwell stopped, his eyes wide with surprise. He looked down at the dark stains spreading across his fine suit jacket. He dropped the knife, took one more shaky step, and then collapsed into the dust. Silence. Miller stood over the body, his gun smoking, his heart hammering in his chest. Blackwood came to stand beside him, reloading his revolver with methodical calm. The lawman and the cattleman, two enemies who had, for a moment, been on the same side. The truth was finally out. Justice, real justice, had been served in a dusty alley behind a saloon. A week later, the town of Redemption felt different. Lighter, the shadow of the gallows had receded. Sarah Jenkins was a free woman, her name cleared, the official story being that new evidence had come to light exonerating her. The town, eager to forget its own rush to judgment, accepted it. Sarah stood with Eli on the porch of the main house at the Blackwood Ranch. She was no longer a guest or a prisoner. She was just there, in limbo. Silas Blackwood walked out to join them. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the sun set over the valley. His valley. Their valley. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said finally, his voice quiet. He wasn't looking at her, but at the horizon. "Not for saving you, for the way I did it, for waiting, for everything before." Sarah didn't answer immediately. She watched Eli chase a lizard in the yard, his laughter carrying on the evening breeze. He was safe. He was happy. That's all she had ever wanted. "Our father, he was a hard man," she said, her voice soft. "He taught you that power was the only thing that mattered, and he taught me to run from it." "He was wrong," Blackwood said. "He broke this family. I spent 20 years building an empire, thinking it would make me strong, but I was just as broken as he was." He finally turned to look at her, and for the first time, she saw not the cattleman, but her brother, the boy she'd known a lifetime ago. "This ranch," he said, gesturing to the land around them. "It's half yours, if you'll have it. Stay, help me build something better than just fences and cattle." Sarah looked at her son, then back at the vast, beautiful land stretching out before them. It wasn't just a place of power and secrets anymore. It was a place of possibility, a place for a new beginning. She gave him a small, fragile smile. "We'll see, Silas. We'll see." Down in the town, Sheriff Miller sat in his office, the wooden bird Eli had carved for him sitting on his desk. He had made a mistake, a terrible one, but he had also fixed it. He had learned that justice wasn't just about following the law. It was about finding the truth, no matter how much it cost or how much it hurt your pride. The rope from the gallows had been taken down. The wood itself would be dismantled tomorrow. Redemption had a chance to live up to its name. The sun finally dipped below the mountains and a new peaceful night settled over the valley. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe.